Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back to the High Middle Ages, slipping through the thick silver curtains of the morning fog that clings to the Po Valley in northern Italy. We are heading specifically to a Benedictine monastery, somewhere near the year 1150 AD now. Just a quick reality check for you. If you were actually there, you'd probably spend half your time coughing from the damp air and the other half, wondering why your wool robe feels like a sack of itchy, angry bees. But you aren't here for the fashion or the monastic silence. You are here for the world's most patient culinary experiment. We are going to live through the slow motion birth of a Parmigiano Reggiano wheel. It's a process that is essentially 5% milk and 95% staring at a shelf, waiting for time to do its thing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always look forward to reading your thoughts during these quiet hours. So drop a comment and tell me which city you're in and what time it is right now. Is it a rainy night in Seattle or early morning in Rome? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up, and the first thing you realize is that the air doesn't just smell like grass. It smells like effort. You are standing on a cobblestone path leading toward the Abbey of San Giovanni, and the dampness of the Emilia Romagna plains is seeping into your boots. To your left and right, the landscape is a patchwork of emerald green. This is the Po Valley, a place where the soil is so rich it practically hums. In the mainstream history of agriculture, this area is the undisputed cradle of the Grana-style cheeses. Before the 12th century, the land here was mostly swamp and thicket, but the Benedictine and Cistercian monks, being the high-tech civil engineers of their day, drained the marshes and turned the valley into a massive, cow-friendly buffet. They created the perfect ecosystem for high-fat milk production, and tonight, you are seeing the result of that divine landscaping. As you walk closer to the monastery's stone walls, you hear the distant, lowing sound of cows. But these aren't the black and white Holsteins you see on modern milk cartons. These are the Vacca Rossa, the red cows of Reggio. Here is a niche, slightly weird fact for you. The red cow is the OG of Parmesan. They produce milk that is incredibly high in protein and fat, which is essential because Parmesan isn't a soft cheese. It is a geological event. The monks realized that if they used the milk from these specific red-haired beauties, the cheese would just taste better. It would survive for years without rotting. You see a monk in a brown habit leading a herd toward the milking shed, his face set in a permanent expression of serene boredom. He doesn't know it yet, but he is currently fueling a global obsession. You step inside the monastery's courtyard, and the temperature drops by 10 degrees. The stone walls are thick enough to stop a siege, but their real job is to keep the heat out. You move toward the caseificio, the cheese-making house. The air inside is warm and thick with the scent of lactic acid and wood smoke. In the center of the room are massive copper cauldrons, shaped like inverted bells, simmering over slow-burning fires. This is where the magic happens. But it's a very messy kind of magic now. Here is a point that academic historians are still debating today. The who got there first dilemma. While the Benedictines of Parma and the Cistercians of Reggio Emilia both claim to be the inventors of the Parmesan wheel, scholars can quite agree on who wrote the recipe down first. Some argue it was a collaborative effort born from the surplus of milk in the newly drained marshes, while others insist it was a competitive cheese race between rival abbeys. There is even a persistent theory that the technique was actually a long-lost Roman secret that the monks rediscovered in their ancient library scrolls. Regardless of who won the cheese war of 1100, the result is bubbling right in front of you. You watch as a master monk, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular, milk-paled arms, uses a giant wooden whisk called a spino to break the curds. He is moving with a rhythm that feels like a dance. He isn't too looking at a clock. He's looking at the texture. He reaches into the warm whey and pulls out a handful of the white grains. He's checking if they look like rice. This is the only moment in the whole process where things happen fast. Once those curds are the right size, they have to be gathered into a heavy linen cloth and lifted out of the cauldron, like a giant, dripping white baby. You step forward to help him, and the weight of the curd ball nearly pulls your shoulders out of their sockets. It weighs over 100 pounds. This is the fresh wheel, and right now, it's soft, squeaky, and looks nothing like the hard crystalline wedge you buy at the supermarket. It is fragile. If you dropped it, it would just become a very expensive puddle on the stone floor. You help the monk place it into a circular wooden mold, or facera, which will give it its iconic shape. You realize, as you wipe the warm whey from your hands, that you have just participated in the liquid phase of the story. From here on out, everything slows down. The cheese is no longer a liquid, and it is no longer a soft curd. It is now a physical weight that needs to be managed. The monk hands you a heavy stone to place on top of the mold to press out the remaining moisture. He nods to you, a silent invitation to the next stage of your apprenticeship. The sun is starting to set over the Po Valley, turning the fog into a golden haze. You look around the room at the other molds. There are dozens of them, all sitting in perfect rows, silent and heavy. You realize that in a medieval monastery, cheese-making wasn't just a chore. It was a form of prayer. The repetition, the silence, and the commitment to quality were all seen as a way to honor the Creator. You feel the weight of that responsibility. You aren't just making food. You are preserving the bounty of the earth for a future that might be decades away. But before we can let this wheel rest on a wooden shelf, it has one more ordeal to survive. It needs to take the plunge. You follow the monk toward the back of the chamber, where a massive stone tank filled with clear, dark water awaits. But it's not just water. It's a brine so salty that a wooden plank would float on it as if it were a cork. The swimming phase is about to begin. You take a deep breath, smelling the sharp, mineral tang of the salt, and prepare yourself for Section 2. The journey of the Parmesan wheel has only just begun, and the clock is just starting to tick. You are standing there, leaning against the cold stone wall of the case officio, watching the steam curl around the heavy oak rafters, like a ghostly white snake. Your arms are still tingling from the weight of that massive curd ball you just helped lift. It's a strange feeling, is it? You in a place of deep, spiritual silence, yet the air is vibrating with the very loud, very physical reality of calories. You look at the master monk, Brother Alberto. Let's call him. And you notice that while his lips are moving in a silent prayer, his eyes are fixed on the copper cauldron with the intensity of a master jeweler. He isn't just making lunch. He's performing an act of medieval alchemy. He's taking the most fragile, perishable thing in the valley, fresh milk, and turning it into a gold that never loses its luster. The mainstream historical fact you have to wrap your head around is that the Benedictine monks were essentially the Silicon Valley disruptors of the 12th century. We like to think of them as quiet guys in hoods hiding in libraries. But in northern Italy, they were hardcore agro-engineers. Before they showed up, the Po Valley was a mess of stagnant water and malaria carrying mosquitoes. The monks didn't just pray for better land. They dug canals, drained the swamps, and invented an irrigation system so advanced that parts of it are still used today. This created a massive surplus of lush, clover-rich grass, which led to a massive surplus of happy, productive cows. But here was the problem. Cows don't stop producing milk just because you've had enough cereal. In the spring, the abbey was drowning in white liquid gold, and without refrigeration, that gold turned into a stinking mess in about 12 hours. You follow Brother Alberto as he carries a small wooden bucket toward the center of the room. Inside is a yellowish liquid that smells sharp and primal. This is the rennet. Now, for a niche, slightly Fact that might make you reconsider your next cheese plate. In the 1100s, the engine that made this cheese possible was the fourth stomach of a suckling calf. The monks discovered that if they dried and ground up this stomach lining, it contained a powerful enzyme that would force the milk to surrender its proteins. It is a bit of a biological irony. To preserve the life of the milk, you needed a secret from the stomach of a creature that lived on it. You watch as Alberto pours a precise amount into the cauldron. He doesn't use a measuring cup. He uses a rhythm passed down through 3 generations of cheese masters. As the milk begins to thicken into a custard-like junket, you notice a group of younger novitiates whispering in the cloister shadows. They likely discussing the very thing that keeps modern culinary historians awake at night, the accidental invention debate. You see, academic historians are still debating whether Parmigiano Reggiano was a deliberate, top-down invention or a happy accident, caused by the monks being too busy to finish a batch of softer cheese. One school of thought argues that the monks were geniuses who intentionally sought a long-life cheese to fuel pilgrims on the road to Rome. Another camp suggests that the first grana, grainy cheese was actually a ruined batch of soft cheese that the monks left on a shelf for a year because they forgot about it, only to find that it had turned into something magnificent. Regardless of whether it was divine inspiration or a monastic oops, the result was a cheese that could survive a cross-continental journey in a saddlebag. You reach out and touch the edge of the copper cauldron. It's warm, pulsing with a gentle heat from the dying embers below. This copper is crucial. Niche fact number 2. The monks used copper not just because it was a good conductor, but because they noticed it gave the cheese a more consistent bloom. Modern science eventually caught up with them, realizing that the copper ions actually help stabilize the proteins during the long cooking process. You retouching a 12th century high-performance reactor. Alberto hands you the Spino again. That giant wooden whisk that looks more like a medieval weapon than a kitchen utensil. Break it, he gestures. You begin to stir the thickening mass, and you feel the resistance. It's like trying to whisk a cloud that's slowly turning into a brick. You have to break the curds into pieces no larger than a grain of rice. If they too big, the cheese will be too moist and rot from the inside out. If they too small, it'll be a pile of dust. You looking for that golden ratio of texture. As you stir, the snarky part of your brain can help but notice the sheer inefficiency of it all. You've been at this for hours, and all you've produced is a wobbly white mass. In our world, we want results in 30 seconds here. The monks measure success in decades. They know that this specific wheel you are stirring won't be ready to eat until the toddlers currently playing in the village square are old enough to get married. There is a profound, slightly terrifying humility in that. You are working for a future person you will probably never meet. The heat in the room is starting to make you drowsy. The sweet, lactic steam acting like a warm, fuzzy blanket for your brain. You watch as Alberto begins to gather the curds with a large linen cloth, moving with the grace of a man who has done this 10,000 times. He is looking for the mori, the soul of the cheese. He gathers the white grains into a tight bundle and hangs it from a wooden pole to drain. This is the birth of the wheel. It's heavy, dripping, and smells like warm, sweet cream. But don't get too cozy yet. Alberto points toward the back of the abbey, where a door leads down into the cool, dark earth. You realize that while the cooking is done, the quiet years are about to begin. The wheel needs its salt bath, baptism. You pick up one end of the wooden pole, the weight of the fresh cheese pressing down on your shoulder, and you follow the monk's flickering candle into the cellar. The transition from the hot, steamy kitchen to the cold, damp stone of the corridor is a shock to your system. The air down here doesn't smell like cream anymore. It smells like thyme and minerals. You hear the faint sound of dripping water, a rhythmic talk. That sounds like a slow-motion clock. You re-entering the deep sleep phase. As you walk, you pass shelves that are already full. Some wheels are white, some are pale yellow, and some, the ones at the far end, are a deep, polished amber, looking more like carved wood than dairy. You realize you re-walking through a library of food. Each wheel is a year of someone's life, captured in fat and protein. You feel a sudden, intense desire to protect the wobbly white bundle in your arms. It's so young, so vulnerable. It does know it. It's about to spend the next 24 months in the dark. You reach a massive stone tank, the surface of the water perfectly still and black. Alberto signals for you to lower the bundle. This is the brine tank. The Mediterranean in a box. The swimming phase is next. You lower the cheese, feeling the buoyancy of the salt water push back against you. The wheel floats there, a white island in a dark sea. You wipe your hands on your robe, the salt already starting to itch your skin. Alberto gives a satisfied nod and leads you back toward the light. The first day is over. You move the story from the cow to the cauldron, and from the cauldron to the deep, salty dark. You retired, you smell like a goat. As breakfast, and your back aches. But as you look back at the dark cellar door, you feel a strange sense of peace. The wheel is safe. The monks are praying, and the valley is quiet. You stand at the edge of a massive stone basin, and the first thing that hits you is the smell of milk anymore. It has the sharp, crystalline sting of salt. The air in this specific part of the cellar is so thick with sodium that you can actually taste it on the back of your tongue. Your skin feels tight, like a piece of parchment that's been left too long in a pickle jar, and the flickering torchlight reflects off the surface of the water in a way that makes the room feel like a subterranean grotto. This is the brining room, the salt sea of the monastery, and your wobbly, white, 100-pound baby is about to take a very long, very quiet bath. You help Brother Alberto slide the fresh wheel into the dark water. You expect it to sink like a stone. I mean, it's 100 pounds of solid protein. But instead, it bobs. It floats there, lazily, with just its shoulders peeking above the surface. This is the miracle of osmosis in action. The mainstream historical fact you should know is that salt was the absolute white gold of the Middle Ages. In a world without freezers, salt was the only thing standing between a civilization and a very hungry winter. For the Benedictine monks, salt was just a kitchen staple. It was a high-stakes strategic resource. They didn't just buy it at the local market. They often controlled salt roads or negotiated complex treaties with coastal cities like Venice or Genoa to ensure a steady supply of Mediterranean sea salt. Without those shimmering white crystals, the Parmesan wheel would be a cheese. It would just be a pile of moldy regret. You watch as the salt begins its slow, invisible invasion of the wheel. It's a violent process disguised as a peaceful dip. The salt doesn't just sit on the outside. It forces its way into the curds, pushing the remaining moisture out. This is how the rind is born. Over the next 20 to 25 days, the exterior of the cheese will harden into a protective armor, a biological fortress that will shield the creamy interior from the air, the dust, and the tiny hungry things that live in the shadows. You essentially watching the cheese grow its own exoskeleton. Now, for a niche, slightly obsessive fact that makes modern health inspectors lose their minds. The memory of the brine. In many of these ancient monasteries, the brine pools were never truly emptied. They were eternal. The monks would just add more salt and more water as needed, but the core liquid remained the same for decades, sometimes even centuries. They believed that the brine had a soul or a spirit that taught the new cheese how to behave. Modern science has actually backed them up on this. These ancient brine pools developed a unique, hyper-local ecosystem of salt, loving microbes and enzymes that you simply can replicate in a sterile, modern factory. When you lower your wheel into that water, you aren't just salting it, you are baptizing it in the history of every cheese that came before it. As you lean over the basin, trying to adjust the position of the wheel with a long wooden pole, you notice a group of monks arguing in low, intense tones near the salt chests. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps medieval archaeologists bickering over their excavation maps: the salt source scandal. Academic historians are still debating whether the early Parmesan masters used expensive, high-purity sea salt from the Adriatic or cheaper, dirty, rock salt from local mines in the Apennine Mountains. Some scholars argue that the monks were purists who demanded the breath of the sea to give the cheese its sweetness, while others insist they were savvy businessmen who used whatever was closest and cheapest, relying on the long-aging process to mellow out the harsh mineral flavors of the mountain salt. The pantry records of 1150 AD are a bit blurry on the details, but your sore back tells you that whatever salt they used, it's heavy in there. That's a lot of it. The snarky part of your brain is probably wondering why we still standing here. It's in the water, Alberto. Let us go get some of that monastic ale. But the ritual of the brine is constant. You have to flip the wheels. Every single day, you have to reach into that cold, stinging water and turn the 80-pound giants over so the salt penetrates evenly. If you forget, one side of the cheese will be soft and vulnerable, while the other side turns into a rock. It's a repetitive, slippery, back-breaking dance. You realize that your robe is now permanently crusty with dried salt, looking like you've been wandering through a blizzard, and your hands are so pruned they look like they belong to a much older, much saltier version of yourself. You look around the room and see hundreds of wheels bobbing in the dark. It looks like a fleet of white ghost ships waiting for a wind that never comes. There is a profound stillness here, a sense that the world outside, with its kings and crusades and taxes, doesn't matter. In this room, the only thing that matters is the salinity. You start to understand the monastic obsession with the rhythm. The monks believe that by salting the cheese, they are fixing the sun, synergy that grew the grass that fed the cows. It as a holy preservation of a fleeting moment in the valley. But then, you notice a tiny bit of scum floating near the edge of the tank. You go to skim it off, but Alberto stops you. He whispers that the film on the water is where the flavor lives. It's a reminder that in the 12th century, clean and pure meant something very different. To the monks, the complexity of the cheese came from the imperfections of the environment. You realize that the brine is a living soup, a dark mirror of the monastery's own history. The dampness of the room is starting to settle into your bones, a cold mineral chill that no amount of prayer can quite ward off. You watch the bubbles pop on the surface of the brine, the size of the cheese as the last of the gases escape. You've been in here for hours, and you've only managed to check one row of tanks. The swimming phase is a marathon of boredom punctuated by moments of extreme physical exertion. You feel a strange sense of kinship with the wheels. You are both trapped in this dark, salty room, waiting for time to transform you into something better. As you prepare to leave the brine room, Alberto hands you a heavy wooden lid to cover the tank. You have to be careful not to let any dust fall in. One stray hair or a bit of dirt could provide a bridge for the wrong kind of mold to cross the salt barrier. You realize that you aren't just a laborer, you are a guardian of a biological boundary. You are the wall between the good microbes and the bad ones. You step out of the brining room and back into the main corridor, the dry air hitting your face like a warm towel. You look at your hands, white with salt, red from the cold, and smelling like a very expensive ocean. You moved the story from the liquid to the brine, and soon we will move from the brine to the shelf. But the cheese is heavy now. It is no longer the light, fluffy curd of the morning. It has absorbed the salt. It has lost its warmth.
You're dripping like a wet dog, your wool habit is about 20 pounds heavier thanks to the brine you've soaked up, and your lower back is currently sending a formal letter of protest to your brain. You've just finished 3 weeks of the swimming phase, and while the cheese will looks relatively refreshed after its long salt bath, you look like you've been shipwrecked. But don't go looking for a place to nap just yet. Brother Alberto is standing by the heavy oak doors of the Magazzino di Stagionatura, the maturation cellar, and he's gesturing for you to grab the wooden hand barrow. This is the moment of the great haul. You are about to move your 90-pound baby from the wet, stinging world of salt into the dry, silent world of dust and wood. Lifting a fresh Parmigiano wheel isn't just a physical task, it's a high-stakes negotiation with gravity. Because the wheel is still green, meaning it hasn't hardened into the stone-like consistency we know today, it's deceptively supple. It feels like a giant, very heavy wheel of cold, dense rubber. If you lift it wrong, the internal structure can shift, creating microscopic eyes or holes that will eventually cause the wheel to explode or rot months from now. You have to cradle it. You have to respect it. As you heave the wheel onto the barrow, the muscles in your forearms cord and burn. You realize that the monks of the 12th century didn't need a gym, they had the dairy industrial complex of the Po Valley to keep them in peak physical condition. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your belt as you wheel the barrow down the stone corridor is that these maturation cellars were the first banks of northern Italy. In a time when coins were unreliable and kings were constantly devaluing the currency, a room full of aging cheese was the ultimate gold standard. These wheels were durable, they were edible, and their value only increased as they sat in the dark. The Benedictines weren't just religious figures, they were the world's first logistical geniuses. They realized that by building these massive, high-ceilinged stone warehouses, they could regulate the supply of food to the entire region. When the grain harvests failed, the cheese remained. You are currently transporting a biological savings account that will likely be used to build a new cathedral or pay off a local warlord in the year 1152. You enter the aging room, and the atmosphere changes instantly. Gone is the sharp, electric scent of the brine. Here, the air is still, heavy, and smells like a mixture of toasted nuts, old hay, and drying timber. It's a peaceful smell, a deep smell that feels like it's been settling in the rafters for centuries. You look up and see the scalera, massive wooden shelving units that stretch all the way to the vaulted ceiling. They are made of thick planks of spruce and poplar, and every single inch of shelf space is occupied by white and golden cylinders. Now, for a niche, slightly obsessive fact about these shelves, the wood matters just as much as the milk. In the monastery, the monks were very particular about using living wood for the scalera. They preferred spruce because the wood is porous and breathes in tandem with the cheese. As the moisture slowly evaporates from the wheel, the wood absorbs it and then releases it back when the air gets too dry, acting like a natural, low-tech humidifier. But here's the weird part, the shelves develop their own memory. After decades of holding cheese, the wood becomes saturated with the specific yeasts and bacteria of the abbey. Some old-school cheesemakers believed that if you replaced an old wooden shelf with a new one, the cheese would get lonely and lose its flavor. You're essentially placing your wheel on a bed of ancestral microbes. As you struggle to lift the wheel onto its designated spot on the third shelf, you notice a group of monks arguing about the standard weight of the wheels. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps medieval economists bickering over their parchment scrolls, the taxation versus texture debate. Academic historians are still debating why the Parmesan wheels became so gargantuan. One school of thought argues that the 40-kilogram, 90-pound, size was a purely physical response to the size of the copper cauldrons the monks could forge. However, a more cynical group of historians suggests it was an early form of tax evasion. Local lords often taxed by the item or by the basket rather than by weight. By making one massive wheel instead of 20 small ones, the monks could arguably claim they were only producing one cheese, effectively cutting their tax bill by 90%. Looking at the sweat dripping off your nose, you're starting to think the tax evasion theory has some merit, nobody would make something this heavy just for the fun of it. You finally slide the wheel onto the spruce board. Thud. The sound echoes through the silent warehouse like a heartbeat. You step back and look at it. It's still pale, its surface slightly damp from the brine. You realize that your journey with this specific wheel has reached a turning point. For the last few chapters, we've been frantic, milking, stirring, salting, hauling. But now? Now the rhythm shifts from action to vigilance. Brother Alberto hands you a small, stiff-bristled brush made of pig hair and a flask of olive oil. He shows you how to gently brush the surface of the wheel to remove any stray salt crystals that might encourage the wrong kind of mold. You move the brush in slow, rhythmic circles, and the sound, shuck-shuck, shuck-shuck, becomes the only thing you hear. It's hypnotic. You realize that you aren't just cleaning a cheese, you are performing a ritual of patience. The snarky part of your brain is currently pointing out that there are over 1,000 wheels in this room, and if you have to brush them all, you'll be 90 years old before you finish. But that's the monastic way. The monks believe that by performing this repetitive labor, they are participating in the slow, natural growth of the world. They aren't in a hurry because the cheese isn't in a hurry. You find yourself matching your breathing to the rhythm of the brush. As the light from the high, narrow windows begins to fade, the shadows of the scalera lengthen across the floor, making the room look like a forest of giant, edible pillars. You feel a strange sense of protective pride. Your wheel is now a permanent resident of the Great Stone Library. It will sit here through the winter snows and the summer heat. It will listen to the monks chanting their prayers in the chapel above. It will slowly lose its greenness and begin the long, molecular transformation into a masterpiece. You take one last look at your hands. They are stained with brine, oil, and the fine white dust of the cellar. You are now officially a part of the invisible army of the cellar. You don't make the cheese grow, the enzymes do that, but you provide the environment that makes growth possible. You wipe the sweat from your brow, feeling the chill of the cellar start to settle in, and follow Alberto back toward the door. The heavy haul is over, but the sacred dance of the aging process is just beginning. Tomorrow, you'll be back. And the day after that. And every week for the next 2 years. You'll be turning, brushing, and listening to the silence of the shelves. You realize that tonight, you didn't just move a cheese wheel, you committed yourself to a 2-year conversation with a piece of milk. You take a deep breath of the nutty, ancient air and prepare yourself for the long, slow wait. The cellar doors creak shut, and the quiet work of the Middle Ages continues in the dark. You're standing in the maturation cellar, and the silence is so heavy you could almost carve it into blocks and stack it on a shelf. It's been exactly 1 week since we hauled your 90-pound baby into this stone forest of spruce boards, and if you were expecting a dramatic transformation, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. The wheel still looks like a pale, oversized hockey puck. But don't let its laziness fool you. Inside that rind, a chemical riot is slowly breaking out. However, before those enzymes can do their job, they need you to perform the most grueling part of the monastic routine. Welcome to the sacred dance of the turning. In the 12th century, quality control didn't involve sensors or lasers, it involved your biceps, a stiff pig hair brush, and a very specific way of not dropping 80 pounds of dairy on your own toes. You approach the shelf where your wool sits. The first thing you notice is the dust. Not common house dust, but a fine, powdery residue that smells like toasted bread and old library books. This is the cheese breath, the particles of protein and fat that migrate to the surface as the wheel exhales its moisture. If you leave that dust there, it becomes a bridge for the wrong kind of mold, the fuzzy green stuff that turns a masterpiece into a biohazard. So, you grab your brush. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your robe is that the Benedictine monks were the first to formalize this cleaning schedule. They realized that Parmesan wasn't a set-it-and-forget-it food. It required constant, rhythmic human intervention. They called this governar, or to govern the cheese. You aren't just a laborer, you are a subterranean politician, keeping the peace between the milk and the air. You reach out and grip the sides of the wheel. It's cold, but it has a strange, tacky grip to it. Now comes the hard part. You have to slide the wheel halfway off the spruce board, balance it on its edge, and flip it over. In the monastery, this is done with a specific, three-step motion that minimizes the risk of cracking the green rind. One hand on top, one hand underneath, a quick pivot of the hips, and, thump, it lands on its other face. Your spine let out a sound like a dry twig snapping, but the wheel is safe. You realize quite quickly that if you do this for the other 2,000 wheels in the room, you'll either become a saint or a person with very impressive shoulders. Now for a niche, slightly weird fact for you, the brushes. You might think any old rag would do, but the monks were obsessed with pig hair. Specifically, they wanted the bristles from the backs of boars that had foraged in the oak forests of the Apennines. These bristles were thick and oily, which allowed them to scrub the rind without scratching it, while simultaneously applying a microscopic layer of boar grease that acted as a natural sealant. You are currently using a tool that is essentially a piece of a forest animal to polish the output of a valley animal. It's the 1150s version of a multi-species ecosystem, all working together to make sure the Jarl, or in this case, the bishop, gets his crystalline crunch. As you move to the next wheel, you hear two younger monks whispering near the ventilation slit. They're debating something that keeps medieval sociologists bickering in their ivory towers today, the lay-brother-labor dispute. You see, academic historians are still debating whether the real monks, the guys who spent all day chanting and copying Virgil, actually touched the cheese at all. One school of thought argues that the cheese-making was handled entirely by conversi, or lay brothers, who were basically uneducated peasants that took light vows just so they could do the heavy lifting. Another camp insists that because the cheese was seen as a divine gift, the high-ranking monks viewed the flipping and brushing as a form of physical prayer, a literal working of the earth, to honor God. Was this a spiritual exercise or just a high-status sweatshop? Looking at the callus forming on your palm, you're starting to think that spiritual exercise is a very poetic way of saying unpaid overtime. The snarky part of your brain is currently calculating how many times this wheel will be flipped before it's ready. If we flip it once a week for 2 years, that's over 100 flips. Each flip moves 80 pounds. You are looking at nearly 5 tons of manual labor for a single wheel of cheese. It's a staggering amount of effort when you realize that the monks weren't doing this for one wheel, but for thousands. You realize that the repetition isn't a side effect of the process, it is the process. The monks believe that time has a weight, and by flipping the cheese, you are literally moving that weight through the seasons. You finish brushing your wheel, and the surface now has a dull, healthy sheen. You take a small flask of linseed oil and rub a tiny amount into the rim. This is a high-stakes moment. If you use too much oil, the cheese will suffocate and turn sour. If you use too little, the rind will crack and let the cellar mites in. You're learning to trust your hand knowledge, that instinctive feeling in your fingertips that tells you when the rind is happy. In the monastery, they don't have thermometers or hygrometers. They have Brother Alberto's left thumb. The shadows in the cellar are shifting as the afternoon sun moves across the high, narrow windows. The dust motes in the air look like tiny gold flakes dancing in the torchlight. You feel a strange sense of belonging in the silence. The rhythmic shuck-shuck of the brushes from other parts of the room sounds like the heartbeat of the abbey. You realize that you've entered the monastic flow. You aren't thinking about the past or the future, you are just thinking about the next 80 pounds of dairy. But then, you notice Brother Alberto approaching with a small silver hammer. He doesn't look at the surface of the wheels, he puts his ear against the stone-like rinds and taps them. Tink, tink, thud. He's looking for the invisible enemy, the air pockets and cracks hidden deep inside the protein. This brings us to the next stage of our long, slow journey. It's one thing to flip the cheese, but it's another thing to listen to it. You realize that the Parmesan wheel isn't just a solid object, it's a vibrating chamber of secrets, and Alberto is the only one who knows the language. You wipe the oil from your hands and pick up your barrow. You've successfully governed your row for the week. Your back hurts, your robe smells like a mixture of wet pig and old milk, and you're pretty sure you'll be dreaming of circles tonight. But as the heavy iron keys jingle on Alberto's belt, signaling the end of the work hour, you look back at your row of giants. They look stable. They look patient. They look like they're winning their battle against time. You take a deep breath of the nutty, cool air and prepare for the silence of the evening. Tomorrow, we stop brushing and start listening. The dance of the turning is over, but the symphony of the cellar is just beginning. That you're standing in the long, narrow aisle between two towering walls of spruce, and your back is still humming with the memory of the sacred dance we finished earlier. Your hands are oily, your robe is dusty, and honestly, you're probably wondering if there's a point where we stop treating these 80-pound cylinders like royalty and start treating them like lunch. But Brother Alberto has stopped in front of a wheel that was birthed 6 months ago, a teenager in the world of Parmesan. He isn't reaching for a knife or a wedge. Instead, he pulls a small, gleaming tool from a leather pouch at his waist. It's a tiny silver hammer, no larger than a child's toy, with a handle made of polished olive wood. He looks at you, presses a finger to his lips to demand absolute silence, and leans his ear against the cold, hardening rind of the cheese. Welcome to the world of the Batu, the monastic X-ray. In the mainstream history of the dairy arts, the hammer test is the undisputed peak of pre-modern engineering. Long before we had ultrasound machines or infrared scanners to check for structural integrity in bridges, the Benedictine monks had already figured out how to use acoustics to peer through 5 inches of solid protein. They realized that a cheese wheel is essentially a vibrating chamber. If the internal structure is perfect, a solid, dense mass of curd, the sound will be high, clear, and resonant, like a cathedral bell. But if there's a hidden crack, a pocket of trapped gas, or a bubble where the fermentation went rogue, the sound will be a dull, flat thud. You aren't just a laborer anymore, you are an apprentice in the symphony of the senses. Brother Alberto begins the rhythmic tapping. Tink, tink tink, tink. He moves the hammer in a rapid, spiraling pattern across the face of the wheel, then down the sides. It sounds like a woodpecker made of precious metal. You watch his face, which is as still as a statue, his eyes closed as he sees the inside of the cheese through his ears. He moves with a confidence that borders on the supernatural. Now, for a niche, slightly weird fact that will make you look at your next cheese platter with a bit more suspicion, the blindfold exams. In the high tradition of the monastery, the most elite cheese listeners, the Bata masters, were often trained in total darkness. The elders believed that sight was a distraction, a noisy sense that prevented the brain from truly mapping the internal geography of the curd. There are legends of blind monks who could not only tell if a wheel had a crack, but could supposedly tell you exactly how many days ago the crack appeared and which cow's milk was responsible for the unstable fermentation. You're currently squinting in the torchlight, but Alberto is operating on a frequency you can barely even hear yet. As you reach out to try a few taps yourself, the hammer feels deceptively light in your hand. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps medieval food historians throwing metaphorical silver hammers at each other, the language of the tap debate. Academic historians are still debating whether this auditory testing was actually a precise science or a form of high-stakes monastic theater designed to keep the peasants from questioning the high price of the abbey's output. One camp of scholars argues that the variations in sound are too subtle for the human ear to consistently categorize, suggesting the hammer test was more about the monk's intuition and gut feeling than actual physics. However, a newer school of researchers has used modern acoustic sensors to analyze these old wheels, and they've discovered that the monks were actually right about 98% of the time. The debate is essentially, were they early scientists, or were they cheese wizards, who used ritual to mask their own incredible sensory memory? You tentatively tap the wheel. Thud. You freeze. Your heart skips a beat. Did you just find a ruined wheel? You look at Alberto, terrified that the last 6 months of effort have just evaporated into a dull vibration. But Alberto just chuckles, a low, dusty sound, and adjusts your grip. You were hitting it with the flat of the hammer, not the point. You try again, letting the weight of the silver do the work. Tink. There it is. The high, clear note of a healthy heart. It's a sound that vibrates through the handle and into your palm, a tiny "everything is okay" message from the molecular level of the dairy. The snarky part of your brain is probably pointing out the absurdity of this situation. Here you are, a grown person in a medieval basement, literally playing "The Floor is Lava" with a hammer and a giant piece of milk. But the stakes are surprisingly high. If a wheel is found to have a major internal flaw, a gonflure or swelling, it has to be removed from the shelf immediately. A bad wheel is like a ticking time bomb. The gases trapped inside can build up so much pressure that the wheel can actually explode, showering the cellar in fermented shrapnel and ruining the surrounding good wheels with evil spores. You realize that your tiny silver hammer is the only thing standing between a peaceful aging process and a very messy, very smelly catastrophe. As you move down the row, the rhythm of the tapping starts to synchronize with your own breathing. Tink, tink, pause. Tink, tink, pause. You start to hear the difference between the young wheels and the elders. The young wheels sound soft and fleshy, like tapping a ripe melon. The older ones, the ones that have been sitting in the dark for over a year, sound like granite. They are becoming stone. You realize that the Parmesan wheel is essentially a record of time becoming solid. Every tap is a check-in on the progress of that transformation. You notice that Alberto doesn't just listen for cracks. Occasionally, he'll stop, sniff the air near the rim, and then give the wheel a particularly aggressive series of taps. He's listening for eyes, the tiny holes that are prized in Swiss cheese but considered a cardinal sin in Parmesan. In the 12th century, an eye in a Parmesan wheel was seen as a sign that a demon or an impurity had entered the milk. It meant the curd wasn't dense enough to reach the gold standard. You realize that the monastery's obsession with solidity is a reflection of their theology. A perfect cheese, like a perfect soul, should be unyielding, consistent, and free of empty spaces. The cold of the cellar is starting to numb your fingers, making the silver hammer feel like a piece of ice. You've only tested 20 wheels, and there are 3 rows left before the evening vespers. You feel a deep, grounding exhaustion, not the frantic tiredness of the morning's flipping, but a mental fatigue born of intense focus. You have to look with your ears for hours on end, ignoring the distractions of the dripping water and the scurrying of the cellar mice. As Brother Alberto signals the end of the session, he carefully wipes the silver hammer with a piece of silk and places it back in its pouch. He looks at the row of wheels and gives a single, satisfied nod. No explosions today. No demons in the curd. The hearts of the cheese are all beating in a healthy, high-pitched rhythm. You feel a strange sense of relief, as if you've just finished a medical round in a very quiet, very delicious hospital. You follow Alberto back toward the stairs, your boots clicking on the stone floor in a way that sounds suspiciously like the silver hammer. You've moved the story from the surface of the Rhine to the dark, vibrating heart of the interior. But don't get too comfortable in your new role as a cheese whisperer. While the sounds are good, there is an invisible army currently working inside those wheels that doesn't care about hammers or prayers. Section 7 is going to take us even deeper, past the wood, past the rind, and down into the microscopic world of the enzymes that are doing the real heavy lifting while the monastery sleeps. You take one last look at the silent rows, realizing that the listening was just the beginning of the mystery. The real magic is happening in the silence between the taps. You are sitting on a low wooden bench in the center of the maturation aisle, your hands resting on your knees, and for the first time, you really look at the stillness around you. The silver hammer is tucked away, the echoes of the tink-tink thud have faded into the rafters, and the monastery above has settled into the quiet hour of the afternoon. But as you stare at the rows of wheels, you realize that stillness is a complete lie. This room is actually the busiest place in Italy. While you've been worrying about your sore back and your salty habit, an invisible army of billions has been working 3 shifts a day inside those wooden shelves. You are currently surrounded by the world's most disciplined workforce, microscopic architects who are slowly dismantling the structure of milk and rebuilding it into the structure of a legend. The mainstream historical fact that you should hold onto like a prayer rope is that the Benedictine monks weren't just religious figures, they were the world's first masters of biological engineering. Their motto, Ora et labora, pray and work, didn't just apply to copying manuscripts or tilling the fields. They viewed the fermentation of cheese as a partnership with the hidden forces of creation. In the 12th century, they didn't have the word enzyme, but they understood the spirit of the change. They realized that if they created the perfect environment, the right temperature, the right humidity, and the right silence, the milk would eventually transcend its own nature. You aren't just a guard in a warehouse, you are a shepherd for a microscopic civilization that has been running on the same software since the dawn of the valley. You lean in closer to one of the year-old wheels, and you notice something strange. The surface isn't just dry, it looks like it's breathing. There's a faint, shimmering haze around the rind, and if you listen very closely, past the dripping water and the wind in the vents, you can almost imagine the sound of a million tiny stonecutters. These are the thermophilic bacteria, specifically the Lactobacillus family. Here is your niche, slightly science-nerdy fact for the night: these tiny soldiers are survivors. They endured the high heat, cooking phase in the copper cauldrons that would have killed most other bacteria. Now, in the cool of the cellar, they are spending their entire lives breaking down long chains of protein into smaller, more flavorful amino acids. They are literally digesting the cheese for you, turning a heavy, rubbery mass into a complex mosaic of flavor. You're essentially watching a slow-motion fire that doesn't produce smoke, only taste. As you watch a single dust mote land on a golden rind, you think about the microclimate mystery that keeps medieval biologists arguing in their white coat laboratories. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy, the terroir versus technique debate. Academic historians and microbiologists are still debating whether the unique flavor of the monastery's Parmesan came from the monastery walls themselves or the grass the cows ate. One school of thought argues that the ancient stone walls and the spruce shelves were seeded with a specific, prehistoric strain of yeast that exists nowhere else on Earth, meaning you could take the same milk to a different building and it would never taste the same. Others insist that the flavor is purely a result of the local grasses and wildflowers of the Po Valley. Was the soul of the cheese in the dirt of the pasture or the dust of the cellar? The debate is essentially, is the cheese a product of the earth or a product of the architecture? Depending on which professor you ask, the answer changes, but looking at the thick, lichen-crusted stones around you, you're starting to suspect the building is doing a lot of the talking. The snarky part of your brain is probably wondering why we're giving the bacteria all the credit. I mean, you were the one who flipped the 80-pound giants this morning. But as you run your hand over the spruce board, you notice it's slightly damp. This is the weeping of the cheese. In the monastery, the monks called these tiny droplets of moisture the lacrima or tears of the dairy. Niche fact number 2, if a cheese will cried too much, the monks believed it was unhappy or possessed by a restless spirit. In reality, it just meant the humidity was too high, but I like the spiritual version better. It makes the cheese feel like a living, breathing roommate. You realize that your job is to be a professional comforter for these weeping giants, ensuring the moisture evaporates at exactly the right speed so the interior doesn't become a swamp. The shadows are deepening now, and the air in the cellar feels even heavier, as if the nitrogen and the oxygen are being replaced by pure umami. You realize that the invisible army is actually working on a schedule that would make a Roman general jealous. In the first few months, they focus on the texture, turning the squeaky curd into something supple. By the 1-year mark, they start working on the crystals, those tiny white crunch bombs that we'll talk about later. By the 2nd year, they are developing the aromatic top notes, the scents of pineapple, nutmeg, and aged wood. You're standing in the middle of a 2-year-long biological symphony, and right now, the orchestra is just finishing the first movement. You notice a small, dark shape scurrying under the bottom shelf, a cellar beetle. You go to shoo it away, but you stop. In the 12th century, even the bugs were part of the army. Certain types of mites were actually encouraged in some cheese-making traditions because their tunneling on the rind helped the cheese breathe. However, for Parmesan, the monks were much stricter. They wanted a sealed vault. You realize that the war of the cellar is a constant battle between the good bacteria inside and the bad invaders outside. You are the general of this stone fortress, and your primary weapon is a bottle of olive oil and a stiff brush. The dampness is starting to make your knees ache again, a reminder that while the enzymes are immortal, you are very much not. You stand up, stretching your arms toward the vaulted ceiling. You look at the rows of wheels and feel a sudden, overwhelming sense of scale. There are tens of thousands of gallons of milk in this room, all being processed by creatures so small you can't see them, over a time frame so long you can barely plan for it. It's the ultimate, monastic flex, the ability to organize the microscopic world with the same precision as a liturgical calendar. As you prepare to head back up to the chapel for the evening prayers, Brother Alberto stops you at the door. He points to a wheel that has developed a slight blush on its rind. He whispers that the army is winning. It's his way of saying the fermentation has stabilized. You feel a strange sense of pride, as if you've just helped a small village survive a long winter. You've moved the story from the physical tapping to the biological breathing. You step out of the cellar and into the cool evening air of the cloister. The sun is a deep, bruised orange over the valley, reflecting the color of the oldest cheese wheels in the back of the room. You've seen the invisible army in action, and you realize that the Parmesan wheel isn't just a food, it's a biological clock that only winds down when you finally cut it open. But before we get to the knife, we have to deal with the maintenance of the armor. The army inside is safe, but the fortress outside needs a new coat of oil. You take a deep breath of the grass-scented air, realizing that Section 8 is going to involve a lot more monastic elbow grease and a very specific bottle of liquid gold. The silence of the cellar is waiting, and the enzymes never take a day off. You're standing in the maturation aisle once more, and the air has transitioned from the sweet scent of umami to something a bit more industrial. Your hands are no longer just stained with salt, they are currently glistening with a thick, golden layer of olive oil. You look at the small ceramic flask in your hand and then at the 80-pound wheel in front of you, and you realize that your job has just shifted from cheese listener to Mona Lisa restorer. In the 12th century, we didn't have plastic wrap or vacuum seals. We had the juice of crushed Mediterranean fruits and a whole lot of repetitive motion. Welcome to the world of the monastic spa treatment, where the rinds get more attention than the monk's own hair. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your oil-stained robe is that olive oil was the high-tech barrier of the medieval world. While the Po Valley was great for grass and cows, it wasn't exactly olive territory, that required the sun-drenched hills of Tuscany or the southern coast. This meant the monastery had to participate in a massive, cross-regional trade network just to keep its cheese from drying out. The oil wasn't just a seasoning, it was a sealant. By rubbing the rind with olive oil every few months, the monks created a semi-permeable membrane. It allowed the cheese to exhale its gases but prevented the moisture from escaping too quickly, ensuring the interior stayed supple while the exterior turned into a suit of armor. You are currently the human interface for 12th century logistics. You dip a piece of raw linen into the oil and begin to scrub. Schlurp, rub, schlurp. The sound is wet and rhythmic, echoing against the stone vaults. You have to press hard. This isn't a gentle massage, you are trying to force the oil into the microscopic pores of the rind. As you work, you notice that the pale yellow surface is beginning to deepen into a rich, burnished gold. It looks like you're polishing a giant piece of amber. Now, for a niche, slightly eccentric fact that will make you look at the black rind cheeses in fancy deli shops with a new level of skepticism, the charcoal illusion. In some medieval abbeys, if a wheel of cheese was particularly old or was being prepared for a high-status gift, say, for a visiting duke or a greedy pope, the monks wouldn't just use oil. They would mix the olive oil with finely ground charcoal or the soot from burned grapevines. This created the legendary crasta nera, or black rind. Why? Partly because it looked incredibly sophisticated and aged, but mostly because the charcoal was a powerful antimicrobial agent. It was the medieval version of a carbon filter. You see a row of these Goth cheeses at the far end of the room, looking like mysterious black monoliths waiting for a wind to blow through the cellar. As you move to the third wheel in your row, you notice a group of elder monks huddled around a particularly dark-skinned wheel, debating in hushed tones. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps medieval archaeologists arguing over their morning espresso, the lard versus oil debate. Academic historians are still debating whether the original Parmesan rind was always finished with expensive imported olive oil. Some scholars argue that in leaner years, or in abbeys further from the trade routes, the monks used strutto, rendered pig lard. They suggest that the classic Parmesan profile actually evolved from the heavy, gamey flavor of pork fat seeping into the outer layers of the cheese. Others insist that the Benedictines were too refined for such peasant tactics and always stuck to the purity of the olive. Was the first king of cheeses actually wearing a coat of bacon grease? The records from 1150 are suspiciously silent on the matter, probably because the monks didn't want the bishop to know they were cutting corners with the kitchen scraps. The snarky part of your brain is probably wondering why you're essentially painting a food item that won't be eaten for another year. But as you scrub, you feel the texture of the rind changing. It's no longer tacky or rough, it's becoming leather hard. You realize that this oiling is the only thing standing between the invisible army inside and the visible invaders outside. If the rind cracks, the moisture escapes, the bacteria die, and the wheel becomes a very heavy, very expensive rock. You are the protector of the microclimate. You are the shield bearer for the enzymes. You notice that the oil is starting to seep into your own skin, making your hands feel incredibly soft, which is a nice perk until you realize you can't grip your wooden barrow without it sliding out of your hands like a greased pig. The smell of the cellar is shifting again. The nutty aroma of the cheese is now mixing with the peppery, grassy scent of the oil, creating a fragrance that is almost intoxicating. You feel a bit like you're working in a high-end apothecary rather than a dairy warehouse. The shadows are growing long, and the light from your tallow candle is flickering as the air moves through the high ventilation slits. You look down at your row. 10 wheels finished. 190 to go. You realize that monastic patience isn't a superpower, it's just a side effect of having absolutely nothing else to do but pray and rub oil on milk. There is a profound, meditative quality to the repetition. You aren't just moving your hand in circles, you are sinking into the timeline of the cheese. You start to understand why the monks viewed this as a spiritual exercise. In a world of chaos, of wars and famines and shifting borders, this room is a constant. The oil will always be rubbed. The wheels will always turn. The salt will always sting. But then, you notice a tiny, almost invisible line on the rim of the next wheel. A crack. You freeze. In the world of the aging cellar, a crack is a breach in the hull of a submarine. It's an invitation for the wrong mold to move in and start a colony. You call Brother Alberto over, and he examines the wheel with the gravity of a surgeon. He doesn't panic. He just reaches for a small bowl of a thick, gray paste, a mixture of oil and flour. He stitches the crack with the paste, sealing the wound. He whispers that even a wounded soldier can still win the war. You feel a strange sense of relief. In this room, mistakes aren't just thrown away, they are mended with patience and a bit of kitchen science. As the evening bells begin to chime from the campanile above, the sound vibrating through the stone floors and into your feet, you realize that your spa day is coming to a close. Your back is a map of dull aches, your robe is a disaster of oil and dust, and you're pretty sure you're going to smell like an Italian kitchen for the next month. But you look at the row of burnished gold wheels, glowing in the fading light, and you feel a surge of genuine accomplishment. You've given the treasure its armor. You've ensured that the microscopic architects inside can keep building their masterpiece in a safe, oiled vault. You follow Alberto toward the heavy door, the oil on your hands catching the last glints of the torchlight. You've moved the story from the biological, breathing, to the physical, protection. You realize that the Parmesan wheel is a fortress, and you've just finished reinforcing the walls. But as you step out into the cool evening air, you look back at the dark cellar and realize that while the armor is strong, it still needs to be heard. Section 9 is going to take us into the final stages of the vigil, the moment where we decide who gets to eat the gold and who gets to use it as a weapon of economic power. You take a deep breath of the damp valley air, realizing that the repetition has finally become a part of you. The oil is dry, the bells are ringing, and the gold is safe for another night. You wake up to the rhythmic, low-frequency vibration of the abbey's bells, the matins call, long before the sun has even thought about touching the horizon. You're back in your wool habit, and as you walk toward the cellar, you realize that your internal clock has been permanently hijacked by the monastery schedule. In this world, time isn't a straight line leading to a weekend, it's a circle. You pray, you milk, you stir, you turn, and then you do it all over again. You're beginning to understand that out here, in the quiet heart of the Middle Ages, there is no distinction between work and worship. You pick up your pig hair brush, feeling the oily residue from yesterday's Section 8 session still clinging to your skin, and you realize you aren't just a glorified dairy butler anymore. You have become a practitioner of cheese as a form of prayer. The mainstream historical fact you should anchor your soul to is the Benedictine rule of ora et labora, pray and work. Saint Benedict, the patron saint of being busy, believed that idleness is the enemy of the soul. For the monks of the 12th century, manual labor wasn't a punishment for the uneducated, it was a spiritual discipline designed to keep the mind focused and the ego small. When you are hunched over a 90-pound wheel of cheese for the 600th time, there is no room for pride. There is only the rhythm of the brush and the silence of the stone. This work was seen as a way of co-creating with God, taking the raw chaos of nature and refining it into a state of ordered perfection. You are essentially scrubbing your way toward salvation. You approach the oldest section of the cellar, the Saints' Row, where the wheels are over 2 years old. They are dark, silent, and look like they've been carved from the very foundations of the earth. As you begin to brush them, you notice that the monks around you are humming. They aren't singing folk songs, they are quietly reciting the psalms in time with their movements. One stroke for one verse. It's a literal synchronization of liturgy and agriculture. Now, for a niche, slightly quirky fact, did you know that in the 12th and 13th centuries, Parmesan was actually considered a pharmaceutical product? Because it was so dense in nutrients and so resistant to decay, medieval doctors, many of whom were monks themselves, prescribed it as a cure for melancholy and digestive sluggishness. There are records of elderly monks being given a specific, medicinal ration of the oldest, hardest cheese to help them endure the cold winters. You aren't just making a topping for a future bowl of pasta, you are essentially a medieval pharmacist, carefully dosing each wheel with the medicine of time and salt. You're polishing a giant, edible pill. As you move your brush in slow, deliberate circles, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps medieval sociologists arguing over their dusty scrolls, the capitalism in the cloister debate. Academic historians are still debating whether these massive monastic cheese operations were the true birthplace of European capitalism. One school of thought argues that the monks were the first industrialists, focusing on surplus, standardization, and market dominance. Basically, they built the first global brand. However, another group of scholars insists that this is a modern projection. They argue that the monk's goal was never profit, but hazo, to borrow a term, or absolute communal harmony and the preservation of God's bounty. Was the abbey a spiritual sanctuary or the 12th century version of a corporate headquarters? The debate is essentially, did the monks love the gold and the coins or the gold and the rinds? The snarky part of your brain is currently pointing out that if this is prayer, it's a very sweaty version of it. Your arms are heavy, and the smell of the cellar, that intoxicating mix of nutty sweetness and damp stone, is starting to make you feel a bit delirious. You realize that the repetition we've been doing for the last 8 sections is actually a form of moving meditation. When you do the same thing every day for years, your thinking brain eventually gives up and hands the keys over to your instinct brain. You stop wondering when the shift will end and start becoming one with the wood and the curd. You aren't turning the cheese, you are the turning. You notice Brother Alberto standing at the end of the aisle, his hands tucked into his sleeves, watching the light from the ventilation slits crawl across the floor. He tells you that a cheese will, like a human soul, needs the weight of the cross to reach its potential. He means the pressure of the other wheels and the literal weight of its own maturity. You start to see the cellar as a metaphor for the monastery itself, a dark, cold place where people are sent to sit in silence until they turn into something much more complex and resilient than they were when they arrived. A niche fact number 2 for the night: the monks were so particular about the vibrations in the cellar that they often forbade anyone from wearing heavy iron-soled boots near the oldest wheels. They believed that sudden, loud noises or tremors could scare the flavor and cause the internal crystals to form unevenly. It sounds like superstition, but modern science has shown that consistent vibrations can affect the way proteins break down. You find yourself walking on your tiptoes, suddenly terrified that a heavy footstep might ruin 2 years of biological labor. The evening bells begin to ring for vespers, the sunset prayer. The sound vibrates through the thick stone walls and seems to resonate inside the cheese wheels themselves, a low, bronze hum that matches the pitch of the cellar. You set your brush down and look at the row you finished. The rinds are glowing in the twilight, burnished and patient. You realize that this work is a direct challenge to the modern world. In our time, we want everything now. We want instant results and quick fixes. But here, in the 1150s, the monks have taught you that the most valuable things in life require you to be a witness to time, not a master of it. You wash your hands in a stone basin of cold water, watching the white cheese dust swirl down the drain. You've moved the story from the physical protection of the oil to the spiritual meaning of the vigil. You feel a deep, grounding exhaustion, not the kind that makes you want to complain, but the kind that makes you want to sit in a quiet garden and watch the shadows grow. You've participated in a ritual that has been running for centuries, and you're starting to realize that the cheese is the only thing in this valley that won't change while you're asleep. You follow the line of monks up the stone stairs toward the chapel. The air is getting colder, and the mist is returning to the valley. You take one last look at the dark entrance to the maturation room. The invisible army is still awake. The hearts of the cheese are still beating. And the gold is still waiting. Tomorrow, we'll see how these spiritual savings accounts became the hard currency of the medieval world, traded for silk and used to settle the debts of kings. But for tonight, the dairy priest is going to rest. You close the cellar door, and the silence returns to the gold. You stand in the long, vaulted aisle of the maturation room, and today the air feels different. It's not just the umami and the wood, it's the sense of security. You look at the towers of golden brown wool stretching toward the ceiling, and it hits you: you aren't standing in a pantry. You are standing in a high-security vault. In the modern world, we obsess over numbers on a screen or pieces of paper in a wallet, but here in 12th century Italy, wealth has a very specific, very heavy shape. You reach out and pat the side of a 2-year-old wheel, hearing that solid, stone-like thud, and you realize that this 80-pound cylinder of fermented milk is more stable, more reliable, and more desirable than almost any gold coin circulating in the markets of Parma. You have become a guardian of the hard currency of the Middle Ages. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your robe is that the Benedictine monasteries were essentially the first central banks of northern Italy. In a time when the local economy was a chaotic mess of barter and unreliable coinage, the abbey provided the one thing everyone needed: a standardized, durable store of value. These Parmesan wheels were the original, gold standard. Because they were so resistant to rot and so difficult to forge, good luck faking 80 pounds of perfectly aged curd. They were used to settle debts, pay for land, and even fund the construction of the very cathedrals that tower over the valley. When a king or a duke needed to show his power, he didn't just show his gold, he showed his cellar. A room like this was a physical manifestation of a monastery's liquidity. You follow Brother Alberto to a small wooden desk near the entrance, where he is meticulously scratching symbols into a parchment ledger. He isn't writing down prayers right now, he's doing inventory. This brings us to a niche, slightly quirky fact about medieval life, the cheese dowry. In the Po Valley, it wasn't uncommon for a wealthy farmer or a minor noble to set aside a specific row of aging Parmesan wheels as a dowry for his daughters or an inheritance for his sons. While coins could be stolen or lose their value if a local lord decided to shave the edges off the silver, a well-tended cheese will only got more valuable every year it sat in the monastery's care. It was the ultimate, long-term investment. Imagine walking into your wedding with a dozen 80-pound wheels of cheese instead of a bouquet of flowers. It was the medieval version of a high-yield savings account that you could eventually eat. As you help Alberto move a particularly dark, amber-colored wheel from the private shelf to the trade barrow, you notice the tension in his movements. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps economic historians arguing in their ivy-covered offices, the monopoly of the curd debate. Academic historians are still debating whether the monasteries deliberately suppressed the emergence of private, secular cheesemaking to maintain their economic stranglehold on the region. One school of thought argues that the monks were benevolent preservers, who shared their technology to help the poor survive. However, a more cynical group of historians suggests that the Benedictines used their control over white gold, salt and milk, to function as a proto-corporate monopoly, effectively making every peasant in the valley a debt slave to the abbey's dairy production. Was the monastery a spiritual haven or a ruthless 12th-century hedge fund? Depending on which ledger you look at, the answer is usually hidden somewhere between the tithes and the curds. The snarky part of your brain is probably wondering why we bother with gold at all if cheese is this good. I mean, gold doesn't taste great with a glass of red wine, right? But the reality of this cheeseconomy is incredibly demanding. If a coin gets dusty, nobody cares. If your cheese currency gets dusty, it might rot and lose its value. You pick up your brush and start on the next wheel, realizing that wealth management in the Middle Ages involved a lot more manual labor and a lot more pig hair bristles than you ever imagined. You are literally scrubbing the inflation off the money. You notice that certain wheels have tiny, intricate symbols carved into their sides, not the official abbey stamp, but private marks. These are collateral wheels. Niche fact number 2. The tradition of using Parmesan as collateral for bank loans is so strong that it actually persists to this day. There is a bank in the Emilia-Romagna region, Credito Emiliano, that still has a high-security warehouse filled with hundreds of thousands of Parmesan wheels acting as insurance for local farmers' loans. When you are brushing these 1150 AD wheels, you are participating in the birth of a financial system that would outlast empires, world wars, and the invention of the Internet. The king of cheeses is also the king of credit. The sun is beginning to set, and the orange light is raking across the floor, making the golden rinds look like literal bars of bullion. You feel a sense of intense responsibility. If a thief broke in, they wouldn't go for the altar silver first, they'd go for the 2-year-old Reggiano. You check the heavy iron locks on the cellar vents, making sure the stone vault is secure for the night. You realize that your repetitive, weekly rhythm of turning and brushing isn't just about food, it's about maintaining the social and economic order of the entire valley. If the cheese fails, the bank fails. If the bank fails, the monastery can't buy the salt it needs to make more cheese. It's a perfect, salty circle of medieval finance. You wipe the fine, money dust from your apron, feeling the weight of the day in your shoulders. You've moved the story from the spiritual, prayer, to the cold reality of capital. You realize that the Parmesan wheel is the most honest form of wealth ever invented, it's a currency that requires constant, loving care to remain valuable. You can't just bury it in the ground and forget about it. You have to touch it, listen to it, and protect it. As Brother Alberto closes his ledger and blows out the candle, the room returns to its natural state, dark, silent, and incredibly valuable. You follow him out, the jingling of his keys sounding like silver coins hitting a tray. You've seen the hard currency of the North, and you realize that in this valley, the true measure of a man's worth isn't found in his pockets, but on his shelves. You take a final breath of the rich, expensive air and prepare for the long, quiet night. Tomorrow, the bank will open again, and there are more coins to flip. But for now, the gold is resting. You're standing in the center of the maturation hall, and the torchlight is low, casting long, dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. The monastery above is silent, the last notes of the Compline prayers having faded into the stone rafters an hour ago. You'd think this would be the time for you to finally rest your aching back, but as you stand there, you hear it, a tiny, sharp scritch coming from the dark corner where the year-old wheels are stacked. You freeze, your grip tightening on your pig-hair brush. You realize that while you are the official guardian of this vault, you are currently being scouted by the most elite infiltration team in the Middle Ages. We're talking about the subterranean connoisseurs, the mice of the Po Valley. In a world where most peasants are eating gruel and hard bread, your cellar is essentially a 5-star Michelin-starred buffet with no closing time. Welcome to the War of the Perimeters, where your job is to keep the tiny ninjas away from the imperial gold. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your belt is that medieval food security was a literal life-and-death struggle against pests. In a monastery, where the bank was made of edible dairy, the monks had to develop defense systems that would make a modern prison warden jealous. They didn't just build thick walls to keep out bandits, they engineered the very foundations to repel rodents. The magazzino was often built with a rat line, a specific layer of sharp, crushed river glass or flint buried in the mortar of the lower walls to stop burrowing invaders. They also used staddle stones, or mushroom-shaped pedestals for the most valuable shelves, creating a physical overhang that a mouse's tiny paws couldn't navigate. You are standing in a high-security fortress where the primary weapons are architecture and a very grumpy cellar cat. Speaking of cats, this brings us to a niche, slightly quirky, and surprisingly controversial fact about monastic life, the clerical cat paradox. You've probably seen those beautiful medieval manuscripts with drawings of cats catching mice in the margins. But here is the weird part, in the 12th century, the official Benedictine rule was actually quite skeptical about pets. Some abbeys considered cats to be unclean or, even worse, distractions from the divine. There are records of stern abbots banning felines from the cloister altogether. But then, the mice would move in and eat the bishop's favorite cheese wheel, and suddenly, the demonic cat would be rebranded as a holy guardian of the pantry. You look at the dark corner and see two glowing green eyes. That's Sister Mauser, a caliph of the shadows who is technically not supposed to be here, but who Brother Alberto accidentally forgets to kick out every night. She's the only one who knows the layout of the vents better than you do. As you adjust a heavy stone block over a ventilation slit, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that keeps medieval archaeologists bickering over their trowels, the cat versus owl debate. Academic historians are still debating whether the great monastic warehouses of Italy relied on domestic cats or managed populations of barn owls for pest control. One school of thought argues that cats were too lazy and prone to eating the cheese themselves, which, let's be honest, is a valid point. These scholars suggest that the monks designed the high, narrow windows of the cellar specifically to encourage owls to nest in the rafters, providing an aerial, drone strike system for any mouse brave enough to cross the floor. Others insist that the archaeological evidence of feline bones near medieval dairies proves the cat was the undisputed king of the caci officio. You look up at the dark rafters, half expecting a silent feathered shadow to swoop down, realizing that you are just a small part of a very complex, very hungry food chain. The snarky part of your brain is probably wondering why a mouse would even bother with your cheese. I mean, the rind is so hard it would probably break a tiny tooth, right? But the tiny invaders are smarter than you think. They don't go for the flat face of the wheel, they go for the heel, the rounded edge where the rind is slightly thinner and more porous. You pick up your tallow candle and perform a perimeter sweep, looking for the telltale signs of a tasting session, tiny, microscopic teeth marks or a dusting of fresh cheese crumbs. If you find one, you have to report it to Alberto, and that will has to be amputated immediately to prevent the scent of exposed curd from drawing in every mouse in the province. You realize that your weekly rhythm of turning and brushing isn't just about hygiene, it's about denying the scent. By keeping the rinds clean and oiled, you are essentially making the vault invisible to the rodent radar. But the mice are only the visible enemies. There is another invader, much smaller and much more persistent, the Acaricero, or the cheese mite. This is where things get a little bit biological horror movie for a bedtime story. If you've ever seen a dusty cheese in a fancy shop, that dust might actually be a living colony of microscopic mites. In some French cheese traditions, these mites are welcomed, but for our 1150 AD Parmesan, they are a plague. Here is a niche fact number 2, the monks used the light of the sun as their primary pesticide. Every few months, they would haul the most suspicious wheels out into the direct sunlight for exactly 1 hour. The ultraviolet light and the dry heat would kill off the mite colonies without melting the precious fat inside. It was a high-stakes biological tan for 80 pounds of dairy. You find yourself checking your own arms for mites, realizing that the cheese itch is a real occupational hazard that no amount of prayer can quite cure. The humidity in the valley is your other invisible invader. Tonight, the fog is so thick outside you can feel the stones sweating. This is dangerous. If the cellar gets too damp, a blue mold called penicillium can move in. While that's great for gorgonzola, it's a death sentence for Parmesan. You move to the hygrostat, which in the 12th century is just a large, dry sponge hanging from a hook. If the sponge feels heavy and floppy, the air is too wet. You have to open the scaccieri, the checkered wooden shutters, just enough to let the mountain breeze in, but not enough to let the moisture from the plains in. You're essentially a medieval air conditioner, adjusting the settings of a stone building using nothing but your intuition and a wet sponge. You finish your sweep and sit back down, the silence of the cellar wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. You realize that the repetition of the last few sections has made you hyper-aware of every sound in the dark. You can distinguish the drip-drip of a leaky roof from the scuttle-scuttle of a mouse, and the purr-purr of the cat from the sigh-sigh of the wind. You've become a part of the building's nervous system. Your rhythm of vigilance is the only thing keeping the invisible army inside from being eaten by the visible army outside. As the first bells for the midnight vigils begin to chime, Brother Alberto appears at the top of the stairs, his lantern casting a warm, orange glow. He asks if the small brothers, the mice, have stayed in their holes. You nod, feeling a strange sense of military accomplishment. The perimeter is secure. The gold is unnibbled. The armor is oiled. You realize that peace in the Middle Ages was something you had to actively defend with a cat and a brush. You follow Alberto out, closing the heavy iron-reinforced door with a satisfying clank. You've moved the story from the economic capital to the tactical defense. You realize that the Parmesan will isn't just a currency, it's a prize. It's the ultimate energy battery of the valley, and everything from a microscopic mite to a local warlord wants a piece of it. You take a final breath of the cool, nutty air and prepare for the short sleep before the dawn milking. Tomorrow, we'll see how the very chemistry of the cheese starts to change, creating those mysterious white, crunch bombs that make a 2-year-old will feel like eating a handful of stars. But for now, the vault is locked, the cat is on duty, and the gold is safe. You are standing in the deepest, oldest part of the cellar, the air so thick with the scent of aged protein it feels like you're inhaling a physical piece of history. You've been at the monastery for over 18 months now, and your hands have the permanent calluses of a man who spends his life wrestling 80-pound cylinders of dairy. You approach a wheel that was birthed in the spring of 1148, back when you were still a green apprentice yourself. You reach out to perform your weekly brushing, but as your tallow candle flickers against the rind, you stop. You notice something odd. It's not a fuzzy mold or a mouse nibble. It's a tiny, brilliant white speck on the surface, looking like a single grain of crystalline sand that has pushed its way out from the heart of the cheese. You lean in, terrified that you've finally failed your perimeter defense, but then you see another, and another. It looks like the wheel is starting to sparkle in the dark. Welcome to the birth of the crunch. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your habit is that this specific, grainy texture is why the Italians call this family of cheeses grana. In the 12th century, the Benedictine monks weren't just creating food, they were accidentally inventing a new state of matter. Most cheeses in the Middle Ages were soft, slimy, or rubbery, things that melted away in a few weeks. But because the monks drained the whey so aggressively and cooked the curd so hot in those copper bell cauldrons, they created a protein structure so dense that it didn't just age, it mineralized. You are witnessing a biological miracle where a liquid, milk, has been turned into a solid that has the structural integrity of a soft mountain. You reach out and touch one of the white spots. It's hard, like a microscopic diamond. This brings us to a niche, slightly science-nerdy fact that would have made a medieval monk cross himself in wonder: those white crystals aren't salt. If you were a peasant in 1150 AD, you'd swear the monks were growing salt inside the cheese, but you'd be wrong. Those are actually crystals of tyrosine, a pure amino acid. As the invisible army of enzymes we talked about in Section 7 continues to dismantle the long chains of milk protein, casein, they eventually break them down into their smallest building blocks. When enough of these blocks pile up in one spot, they can't stay dissolved anymore. They crash out of the moisture and form tiny, crunchy stars. In the monastery, these were often called the divine grit. The older the cheese, the more grit it has. You realize that you aren't just looking at aged milk, you are looking at the literal debris of time. As you run your thumb over the sparkling rind, you find yourself pondering a point of intense academic controversy that still has food historians and geneticists arguing over their petri dishes: the barbarian cow theory. Academic historians are still debating whether the unique chemical profile of Parmigiano Reggiano was only possible because of the specific cattle brought to Italy by barbarian invaders like the Lombards or the Huns centuries earlier. One school of thought argues that the local Roman cattle weren't high-protein enough to create those tyrosine crystals. They believe the crunch is actually a Northern European genetic gift wrapped in an Italian landscape. Others insist that the cows were purely local and that it was the monks' unique, triple cooking technique that forced the proteins to crystallize this way. The debate is essentially, was the magic in the bloodline of the beast or the brain of the monk? Depending on which side of the Alps the historian comes from, you'll get a very different answer, but the result is currently making your fingertips feel like they're touching a starry sky. The snarky part of your brain is probably wondering why we're getting so excited about sand in our food. In any other context, if your dinner crunched like you dropped it on a beach, you'd send it back to the kitchen. But in the world of Parmesan, this sand is the mark of royalty. It's the crystalline proof of age. You realize that for the last 2 years, you've been a time manager. You haven't added anything to these wheels: no spices, no herbs, no preservatives. You've just provided the silence and the turning. And in return, the cheese has built itself into a geological wonder. You start to feel a strange sense of envy. These wheels get to sit in a dark room and turn into diamonds, while you just get older and more tired. You notice Brother Alberto approaching, carrying a small, sharp-pointed knife, not the big wedge breaker, but a delicate, sampling tool. He gestures to the sparkling wheel and asks you what you see. You tell him it looks like the night sky. He smiles, a rare expression that crinkles the edges of his eyes, and tells you that the stars are a sign that the cheese is praying. He believes the crystals are a physical manifestation of the monastic silence. Niche fact number 2, in the 12th century, it was believed that if a sinner entered the cellar, the divine grit would melt away and the cheese would become soft and dishonest again. You find yourself mentally reviewing every bad thought you've had this week, suddenly terrified that your lack of patience might turn 80 pounds of gold back into a puddle of mush. The rhythm of the work changes now. You aren't just brushing anymore, you are feeling for the crystals. You move your hand across the rind, and when you feel that subtle vibration of the sand beneath the surface, you know that specific will has reached its peak. It's a sensory experience that links your nervous system to the molecular breakdown of the dairy. You realize that the crunch is actually a sound as much as a texture. When you eventually cut this will open, the knife will make a sound like a small glacier cracking, a sharp, percussive snick that only happens when the tyrosine stars are perfectly aligned. As the shadows in the aisle grow longer, you look at your own hands. They are stained with the oils and the dust of the graina, and for a second, you imagine that your own bones are starting to crystallize like the cheese. You've been in this cycle for so long that you've forgotten the world outside. The chemistry of the perfect crunch has become your personal philosophy. You understand now that the best things in life, the deepest flavors, the strongest bonds, the most resilient souls, aren't built through speed. They are built through the slow, agonizing, crashing out of the essentials. You have to break the milk down to its very atoms before the stars can appear. The bells for the Vesper prayers begin to chime, and the sound seems to vibrate through the spruce boards and into the divine grit of the wheels. You imagine the tiny crystals shimmering in response to the bronze bells. You feel a profound sense of satisfaction. The visible army of the mice is gone, the invisible army of the enzymes is winning, and the stars are coming out in the cellar. You've moved the story from the defensive war of the perimeters to the internal alchemy of the crunch. You follow Alberto out of the old section, your boots making a gritty sound on the stone floor. You realize that while the crystals are there, they are still a secret. To the world outside, these wheels are just heavy, brown-skinned cylinders. They need a mark of truth before they can leave the monastery. They need to be branded so that no one can mistake them for a common, non-crystalline peasant cheese. Section 13 is going to take us to the most intense, most visceral moment of the whole 2-year vigil, the fire branding. You take a final breath of the starlit air, realizing that the transformation is nearly complete. The sand is in the wheels, the enzymes are resting, and the fire is being lit in the courtyard. Tomorrow, we lock the wheel's identity in iron and smoke. You're standing in the monastery courtyard, and the transition is almost violent. For 18 months, your world has been the cool, humid embrace of the stone cellar, where the loudest sound was the heartbeat of a mouse and the only light was the flickering of a tallow candle. But today, the Valley sun is white and aggressive, and in the center of the yard, a massive iron forge is roaring. The air doesn't smell like nutty umami or aged spruce anymore, it smells like charcoal, sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of hot iron. You're helping brother Alberto roll a 2-year-old veteran, a wheel from the Saints Row, toward a wooden table. This is the moment of the Marchio a Fuoco, the fire branding. After 700 days of anonymity, this wheel is about to receive its name of truth. It's the medieval version of a passport office, but with a lot more smoke and a very high risk of third-degree burns. The mainstream historical fact you should tuck into your apron is that the concept of protected designation of origin, what we call DOP today, actually began right here, in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Benedictine and Cistercian monks were the first to realize that because their cheese was so valuable, people were already trying to fake it. Merchants in the markets of Milan and Bologna were trying to sell abbey-style cheese that was actually just salty cow fodder. To protect the monastic brand, the abbeys established a rigid system of certification. Every wheel that passed the silver hammer test had to be branded with the abbey's specific seal. This wasn't just a label, it was a legal guarantee. In a world of chaos, the mark of the monastery was the only thing a buyer could actually trust. You are witnessing the birth of the global luxury brand, forged in fire. You watch as a senior monk, the cheese notary, approaches the forge. He pulls out a heavy iron tool with a long handle. The end of the tool is a circular plate carved with the intricate symbols of the Abbey of San Giovanni. The iron is glowing a terrifying shade of translucent orange, vibrating with the heat of the coals. Now, for a niche, slightly snarky fact for you. The monks were so obsessed with the purity of the branding process that they were incredibly particular about the wood used in the forge. They would only use sweet woods like fruit trees or aged oak. Why? Because they believed that angry woods like pine or resin-heavy larch would produce a smoke so acrid it could penetrate the thick rind and poison the flavor of the cheese during the few seconds of branding. It's a level of sensory paranoia that would make a modern craft coffee roaster look like an amateur. You're standing in a courtyard where even the smoke is curated to ensure your 80-pound masterpiece doesn't end up tasting like a burnt Christmas tree. As the notary prepares the iron, you notice a group of local merchants huddled near the gate, watching with intense, greedy eyes. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps medieval legal historians bickering in their parchment-filled archives: the Great Geographic Intellectual Property War. Academic historians are still debating whether the name Parmigiano, from Parma, or Reggiano, from Reggio, has the older claim. One school of thought argues that the Benedictines of Parma invented the branding system to flex their political muscle over the valley. Another camp insists that the Cistercians of Reggio were the true innovators and that Parma simply had better marketing and closer ties to the sea salt trade routes. The debate is essentially, who gets the intellectual property rights to 1,000 years of curd? Looking at the hot iron, you realize that in 1150 AD, the right answer usually belonged to whoever had the biggest abbey and the hottest fire. The notary signals for you to hold the wheel steady. You press your weight against the cool, dark amber rind, feeling the tyrosine crystals we talked about in section 12 vibrating beneath your palms. The monk brings the glowing iron down. The moment it touches the cheese, there is a loud, violent hiss, and a thick cloud of white, sweet-smelling smoke erupts, momentarily swallowing everyone in the circle. The smell is unforgettable. It's the scent of toasted sugar, singed protein, and ancient dust. It's not unpleasant, but it's intense. It feels like it's coating your lungs. You watch as the hot iron sinks just a few millimeters into the leather-hard rind. The notary holds it there for exactly the time it takes to recite one Ave Maria. If he pulls it too early, the mark will be faint and easily forged. If he stays too long, the heat will melt the fat beneath the surface, creating a wound that will eventually rot. It's a high-stakes timing game played with a prayer as a stopwatch. When he lifts the iron, the smoke clears, and there it is. The mark is a deep, scorched brown, looking like it was carved into stone rather than dairy. The symbols are crisp and undeniable. The wheel is no longer just milk and time. It is now official treasure. You feel a strange sense of relief, as if the wheel has finally graduated from its 2-year University of Silence. It has a name, a rank, and a destination. The snarky part of your brain is probably wondering why we didn't just use ink. I mean, it would be a lot safer, right? But in the Middle Ages, ink could be washed off. Fire is forever. You realize that the repetition of the last 2 years, the flipping, the brushing, the listening, has all been leading to this 1-second encounter with the forge. The marchio a fuoco is the seal on the contract between the monk, the cow, and the consumer. It says, we didn't cheat. We didn't hurry. We waited for the stars to appear in the curd, and here is our proof. As the notary moves to the next wheel in the row, you use a damp cloth to wipe the ash from your masterpiece. The branded mark is still warm to the touch, radiating a gentle heat against your fingers. You feel a surge of pride. This wheel, which you've personally flipped over 100 times, is now a recognized citizen of the economic world. It can be sent to the Pope in Rome, or traded for 3 bolts of Flemish silk, or used to pay the dowry of a duke's daughter. It's a hard currency that has been baptized by fire. The sun is moving toward the horizon, and the forge is starting to cool, the orange glow of the coals fading into a soft, ashy gray. You help Alberto roll the branded veteran back toward the cellar, but not to its old shelf. It's heading to the departure gate, the room near the stables where the pack mules are being readied. The long vigil is almost over. You've guarded the perimeter, you've fed the invisible army, and you've locked the identity in iron. You take one last look at the courtyard, where the smell of the branding smoke still lingers in the air like a fragrant ghost. You've moved the story from the internal alchemy of the crunch to the external mark of truth. You realize that the Parmesan wheel is a finished poem, and the brand is the final punctuation mark. But before the wheel leaves the monastery walls, it has one final secret to give up. The most emotional moment of all is coming, the moment where the stone is finally broken, and the sun inside is revealed. You take a deep breath, realizing that section 14 is where the waiting finally ends. The fire is out, the iron is cold, but the knife is being sharpened. You are standing in a small, vaulted room adjacent to the abbey's refectory, and for the first time in 2 years, the silver hammer and the pig-hair brush are nowhere to be seen. The air here is still, but it lacks the damp chill of the aging cellar. Instead, it feels expectant. On a thick oak table, illuminated by a single shaft of afternoon sunlight, sits your masterpiece. It's the wheel from section 1, the one you saw born from a copper cauldron, baptized in a salt sea, and flipped until your shoulders felt like they were made of rusted hinges. It is now a deep, burnished gold, its rind as hard as a river stone and stamped with the fire-branded seal of the monastery. You look at Brother Alberto, and for once, he isn't pointing at a dusty shelf. He hands you a set of 3 small, strange-looking knives. They don't have long blades, they are shaped like heavy metal almonds with short, stubby wooden handles. This is it. The stone is about to be broken. The mainstream historical fact you should know about this moment is that Parmigiano Reggiano is one of the only cheeses in the world that is never sliced. In the 12th century, just as today, the rule was absolute: you do not cut the king of cheeses, you break it. Because of that incredibly dense, crystalline structure we've been monitoring, a long knife would simply get stuck or shatter the internal grain of the curd. Instead, the monks developed the coltellino a mandorla, the almond knife. It is a wedge, a tool of physics rather than a tool of butchery. You aren't trying to create a smooth surface, you are trying to coax the cheese to fail along its own natural geological fault lines. You are essentially a diamond cutter working with an 80-pound piece of dairy. You take the first knife and, under Alberto's watchful eye, you begin to score the rind. You run the sharp point of the almond knife in a straight line across the diameter of the wheel, then down the sides, and across the bottom. Scree. The sound of metal against that 2-year-old rind is like a needle on a record. It's a high-pitched, satisfying scratch. Now, for a niche, slightly aromatherapeutic fact, in the Middle Ages, the opening of a mature Parmesan wheel was considered a significant event for the local infirmary. There are records suggesting that monks would bring the sick and the elderly to the room during the first crack. Why? Because the volatile aromas trapped inside a wheel for 700 days are so concentrated that the initial release was thought to clarify the lungs and invigorate the spirit. It was a primitive form of food-based smelling salts. You lean in, your nose just inches from the scored line, and you realize that even through the hard armor of the rind, the scent is starting to leak out, a dizzying mix of dried pineapple, toasted nutmeg, and the smell of a summer meadow that hasn't seen the sun in 2 years. As you prepare to drive the first wedge deep into the center, you notice a scribe from a rival abbey standing in the doorway, taking frantic notes. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps Boccaccio scholars and food historians throwing metaphorical wedges at each other: the mountain of cheese debate. In his famous 14th-century work, the Decameron, Giovanni Boccaccio describes a mythical land called Bengodi where there is a mountain made entirely of grated Parmesan cheese, and people live in huts made of sausage. Academic historians are still debating whether this was a literal description of the massive scale of 14th-century monastic cheese production or a satirical snark on the monks' incredible wealth. One school of thought argues that Boccaccio was highlighting the abbey's hoarding of food during a famine, while others believe he was simply a fanboy of the divine grit we talked about in section 12. Looking at the 80-pound gold bar in front of you, a mountain of this stuff doesn't seem like much of an exaggeration. The snarky part of your brain is probably wondering why you're sweating. I mean, it's just a snack, right? But as you grip the almond knives, you realize you are about to destroy a 2-year-old piece of art to find out if you were a good cheese shepherd or a failure. You place 2 knives on opposite sides of the scored line and a third one right in the center. Alberto gives you the nod. You lean your weight into the handles. Push. Twist. Listen. For a few seconds, nothing happens. The cheese resists you with the stubbornness of a medieval castle wall. But then, you hear it. Sirararak. It's a low, resonant sound that vibrates through the oak table and into your chest. It sounds like a glacier calving into the sea or a heavy wooden door being forced open. A jagged, lightning bolt crack appears along the line you scored. You twist the knives one more time, and suddenly, the resistance vanishes. The wheel heaves, sighs, and splits perfectly in two. The sight inside is breathtaking. It's not smooth like butter or white like milk. The interior of the wheel is a craggy, golden landscape of cliffs and valleys. It looks like a desert canyon captured in a circle. Those tyrosine stars we talked about are everywhere, catching the sunlight and shimmering like tiny embedded diamonds. The texture is granular. It's made of millions of tiny, compressed pebbles of protein that have been waiting 2 years to see the light of day. And then, the smell hits you. It's not just a scent, it's a physical event. It's an explosion of aged energy. It smells like the very essence of the valley, the grass, the rain, the wood smoke of the monastery, and the slow, steady breath of the seasons, all distilled into a single, overwhelming cloud of umami. You feel a sudden, intense hunger that has nothing to do with your stomach and everything to do with your soul. Alberto takes a small piece that has crumbled off the edge, a scallia, and hands it to you. The snarky part of your brain is currently saying, finally. 2 years for one bite. But as you put the cheese in your mouth, the snark stops. It doesn't melt like modern cheese. It shatters. First, you feel the crunch of the crystals, those little stars of time, breaking against your teeth. Then, as the warmth of your tongue hits the fats, the flavor begins to unfold in layers. It's salty, then sweet, then savory, then something fruity that lingers for minutes after you've swallowed. You realize that you aren't just tasting milk, you are tasting the last 730 days of your life. You are tasting every flip, every brush stroke, and every silent prayer you offered in the dark. You look at the 2 halves of the will sitting on the table. They look like 2 halves of a golden sun. You've moved the story from the firebranding of the exterior to the revelation of the interior. You realize that the repetition wasn't a chore, it was a build-up. The boredom was the seasoning. The wait was the chef. As the sun sets over the monastery, painting the stone walls in the same amber hue as the cheese, you realize that your apprenticeship is coming to an end. The wheel is open, the secret is out, and the gold has been found. But there is one final chapter to this journey, a reflection on the eternal circle. We need to see how this one moment of revelation fits into the thousands of years of history that came before and the centuries that would follow. You take a final, lingering bite of the divine grit, realizing that section 15 is where the circle finally closes. The stone is broken, but the legacy is solid. The golden light of the late afternoon has finally slipped away, leaving the small room near the refectory in a state of warm, amber twilight. You are standing by the heavy oak table, staring at the crumbs of divine grit that still litter the surface where your masterpiece once sat. The 2 halves of the sunlight will have already been wrapped in coarse linen and loaded onto the back of a sturdy pack mule, destined for the high table of a distant cardinal or perhaps to be traded in the bustling markets of Venice for spices that smell like another world. You look at your hands, and for the first time in 2 years, they are idle. The pig hair brush is resting on a hook, the silver hammer is silent in its pouch. You've moved the story from the first drop of milk in section 1 to the final crack of the stone in section 14, and now, as you stand in the quiet echo of the abbey, you realize that the circle isn't just closing, it's starting all over again. The mainstream historical fact that you should take with you as you exit this medieval dream is the staggering consistency of the Parmesan legacy. If a monk from 1150 AD were magically transported to a modern dairy in the hills of Emilia-Romagna today, he would recognize almost every step of the process. While we've added stainless steel and digital thermometers, the Holy Trinity remains unchanged: local milk, sea salt, and an absurd amount of time. It is one of the few things in human history that resisted the urge to innovate. The monks found perfection early on, and they had the stubbornness to keep it that way for nearly 9 centuries. You haven't just been making food, you've been guarding a constant in a world that never stops shifting its feet. You walk back toward the maturation cellar one last time, your boots clicking on the stone floor. You notice a younger novitiate, a boy who probably wasn't even born when you salted your first wheel, struggling to haul a fresh, wobbly white bundle toward the brine tanks. This brings us to a niche, slightly quirky, and very frugal fact about monastic life: the afterlife of the rind. In the monastery, nothing was ever wasted, least of all the hard, fire-branded skin of the cheese. While the nobility ate the crystalline heart, the monks kept the rinds. They discovered that if you tossed those rock-hard pieces of leather into a pot of boiling water with some old beans and cabbage, the rind would soften and release its concentrated umami into the broth. It's the origin of minestrone as a high art form. You realize that even the trash of your 2-year labor is enough to sustain a community for a week. You're essentially building a slow-release flavor bomb that keeps on giving long after the center is gone. As you watch the boy disappear into the dark, you find yourself pondering the final point of academic controversy that keeps medievalists and climate scientists arguing over their digital charts: the lost bacteria debate. Academic historians are still debating whether the Parmesan of the 12th century actually tasted better or at least more wild than what we have today. One school of thought argues that the modern, standardized DOP rules have sanitized the cheese, killing off the diverse, funky, hyperlocal strains of bacteria that lived in the monks' unwashed wooden tools and stone walls. They believe we are eating a polite version of a once ferocious beast. Others argue that the monks' lack of hygiene actually led to a high rate of spoiled bomb wheels, and that modern science has finally allowed the true flavor of the milk to shine without the interference of stray barnyard spores. The debate is essentially, do you want the soul of the dirt or the purity of the craft? Looking at the thick, mossy stones of the abbey, you're inclined to think the dirt had a lot to do with that magical pineapple scent we released earlier. The snarky part of your brain is currently pointing out the irony of your situation. You've spent 700 days obsessing over a wheel of cheese, and now it's on a mule heading to someone who will probably grate it over a bowl of soup without a single thought about Brother Alberto's sore back. But that's the beauty of the monastic rhythm. It's not about the credit, it's about the hazo of the process. You've learned that the boredom we complained about in the early sections was actually a shield. It protected you from the frantic, meaningless noise of the world outside. By focusing on the turning, the brushing, and the listening, you've synchronized your own heartbeat with the slow, molecular dance of the tyrosine crystals. You've become as patient as the spruce boards. You take a seat on the stairs, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of violet and gold. You realize that the repetition of the last 15 sections has fundamentally changed you. You no longer see time as a limited resource to be spent, you see it as an ingredient to be folded in. You think about the cow, the grass, the salt, and the fire. You think about the invisible army that is currently working in the dark beneath your feet, oblivious to the fact that their general is retiring. The monastery bells begin to ring for the final prayer of the day, and you find yourself humming along, your voice matching the low, resonant frequency of the bronze. You look at your hands one last time. The salt stings are healed. The olive oil has made your skin as supple as the curd. You've carried the weight of the Middle Ages on your shoulders, and you've come out the other side with a mouth full of stars. You realize that the eternal circle is the only thing that matters. The wheel is broken, the mule is gone, but the milk is already being collected for tomorrow's cauldron. The rhythm doesn't end, it just waits for the next set of hands to pick up the brush. You feel a profound sense of historical completion. You've done your part in the long, salty vigil. You've guarded the gold, and the gold has rewarded you with the quietest mind you've ever had. As Brother Alberto approaches to lock the cellar door for the night, he gives you a small, knowing smile and hands you a piece of hard bread and a tiny wedge of the veteran wheel. It's a simple meal, but as you sit there in the darkening cloister, the flavor of the cheese connects you to every person who ever lived in this valley, from the Roman legionaries to the future chefs of the 21st century. You've traveled through time without moving an inch, all by following the path of a piece of milk. You take a final breath of the nutty, stone-scented air and realize that the wait was the best part of the meal. The door clicks shut, the keys jingle, and the monastery returns to the silence that makes the gold grow. 1088. Now, let the world of the stone abbey and the golden cheese wheels begin to soften and fade at the edges. The sound of the monastery bells is growing quieter, turning into a gentle, rhythmic hum that matches the steady rise and fall of your own breath. Imagine the cool air of the Italian cellar drifting away, replaced by the warmth and weight of your own blankets. The scent of aged wood and toasted nuts is no longer a physical presence, but a faint, comforting memory, drifting into the quiet corners of your mind. You are no longer the guardian of the vault. Your hands are resting now, the phantom weight of the 80-pound wheels finally lifting from your arms. The long, vaulted aisles of history are closing for the night, and the invisible army of enzymes has taken over the watch. You don't have to listen for cracks or brush away the dust anymore. You are safe. You are warm. You are drifting on a velvet tide of quiet thoughts, moving slowly toward the edge of a deep, peaceful sleep. The valley is still, the cows are resting in the tall grass, and the monastery is wrapped in a blanket of silver mist. There is nothing left to turn, nothing left to salt, and nothing left to wait for. The rhythm of the turning has become the steady, slow rhythm of your own heart. You are part of the history, you are part of the silence, and you are finally at rest. Everything is in its place. The gold is safe. The story is told. Sleep now, feeling the weight of the years lift away, and let the silence of the night carry you home. The story ends here. Good night.